Warren, it's Brian Coyne here. I'd just like to come in on this discussion you've been having about absolute truth, relative truth and objective truth. I don't know if this will help, but I'd like to make really three comments that I think are often missing from the theological type debates that we have on truth. Keep talking about this book, Benedict the 16th and the Search for Truth by Robert Tilley, and I had Paul Collins up here the other day. At the end of his book, he spends a couple of chapters essentially setting Collins up as a straw man, and we had a good discussion about that. We're not going to do anything about that at the moment, but I will review the book as soon as I can find a spare space on Catholica somewhere. We're running pretty flat chat at the moment. The three things I'd like to say are this. Two of them are really new perspectives on truth that have come to us through fundamental physics, quantum physics, in the last 100 years. The first one is to do with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which I've spoken about on the forum before. For a long time, scientists believed, or not just scientists, the whole culture in Western civilization believed that if we searched long enough, in a scientific sense, that eventually we'd get down with our microscopes or up with our telescopes, and we'd eventually be able to penetrate down and find out what made up matter, what made up being. We'd be able to reduce it down to a mathematical formula or a chemical formula. Things were going along really well for 200 or 300 years, and then this was down at the very micro level. They suddenly came up with a big problem, that we had this model of the atom with the electrons buzzing around the nucleus. And they found that you can't define both the speed and the position of an electron at one and the same time. You are able to measure the position, but if you do that, you can't know what speed or direction it is going at. I should have said velocity there at first, because velocity is slightly different to speed because it has both components of speed, and velocity also has a direction component attached to it as well. Now, or the other alternative is that you can define the velocity, but if you do that, you don't know where in the dickens it is. You can't actually place it. Now, this is today seen as a fundamental principle in physics called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that you can go down so far, but you can't define something absolutely. Now, the point in this is that even though we cannot measure or observe what both those quantities are at one and the same time, we presume or speculate that there must be a value there. It's just that we cannot measure that. So, in a sense, there is an absolute truth. We would surmise that the spinning electron has both a position and a velocity, but the limitation on us is an observing limitation. We cannot know both quantities at the same time. Now, that's a huge leap in the way human beings have thought. That we think, oh, I can see this table here, or I can see this chair, that's absolute, oh yes, that's the truth. But when you get down, that's not the case, that you cannot define it as concretely as we can define things in the macro world. A lot of this stuff doesn't have application in the immediate macro world, and people who are cut off from fundamental physics, are just not into this territory. But they need to be, because there are applications, as I'll go on the next thing to talk about, which will show that there is an application into the world in which we inhabit. The second area is Einstein's insights into relativity. For example, and this can have practical applications. For example, time is relative. We all tend to think of time as being an absolute, and we have Greenwich Mean Time, and if I'm anywhere in Sydney, I can look at my watch and somebody down there at Penrith or Parramatta or Sydney City will have the same time, and we go, that's fine. The reality is that at different altitudes, time runs at a slightly different rate. The higher the altitude is, I think it's the higher the altitude you go, the slower it gets. If you're up in a jet aeroplane, it's running at a slower rate, but one that is measurable. It's neither here nor there, for a trip from here to the United States or something, but it is a measurable difference. So in physics today, it is critical, both from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and from Einstein's theories of relativity, that when you talk about truth, you always have to define where you're observing your measurement from. Your truth or your observation is relative to the observer. So that if I'm up here at, I think we're 500 metres above sea level, a little bit more, time is actually running this tiny little bit slower than if I was sitting down on the beach at Bondi. And if one was being really accurate, one would have to define this difference, that hey, this observer is actually sitting up 500 metres above the observer sitting on Bondi Beach. Some of this stuff where it becomes important is, for example, in this big experiment going on in CERN in Switzerland at the moment, where they're trying to smash atoms to find the God particle. When you get up at the, because time is not only relative to altitude, it's also relative to speed, and when you get up to very fast speeds, as you have in accelerators like that one at CERN, these differences do become significant. It's also significant, for example, in the experimentation trying to get back to absolute zero time. What happened at the Big Bang? We keep hearing that scientists can't go back beyond, 1/1000th of a second after the Big Bang. And they're constantly pushing back the barriers. Once it was 100th of a second. I don't know what they're up to now. It might be 1,000th of a second or several thousandths of a second after the Big Bang. But part of this problem is, again, to this relativity of time, and when you get to that absolute zero, the time t equals 0 causes all the equations to go berserk, and you end up with just garbage, and it doesn't make any sense. So they're the two things I put on the table that have changed our perceptions of what we mean when we talk about truth, and particularly when we put these qualifiers on it. What is absolute truth? What is objective truth? What is relative truth? The other place, and this is more in the realm of theological moral discussion, I suppose, and I first became aware of this when I was working in the Catholic education system, and principals, directors of Catholic education and bishops have a problem with this these days. Somebody's little Joe or Sally in year 5 at school gets a bad report or something, and the parent really gets it in for the teacher. And so they go off on a little witch hunt, you know, that Miss Jones or Mr. Smith, they're a bad teacher and they shouldn't be in Catholic schools because why Johnny or Sally got a bad mark. It's human nature. Some people act like this. And they go off and they do their search. And they find out, that Miss Jones spent Friday night over at Mr. Smith's house and they were up to doing naughty business. So, you know, the report goes in that this teacher shouldn't be a teacher in a Catholic school because they were engaged in illicit conduct last Friday night. And I have the proof because I went over there and staked out their house and, you know, whatever other proofs they've got. They take this up to the principal or the director of the CEO. CEOs have, you know, human relations, I don't know what they call them, departments that have to handle this sort of garbage. Bishops get it too. The reality is that information that person has found, while it may well be truth, is actually none of that person's business whatsoever. They went out trawling for it, and it is no business of theirs to be reporting that to anybody else. In fact, they are the transgressor for reporting it, because it is confidential. If we wanted to do a search on any person in the world, even a pope, even a cardinal, even a bishop, you can find some sin they've committed. And we could go and report it to somebody and say, oh, you know, they shouldn't be a cardinal or a pope or a bishop or a teacher or whatever. A lot of people don't seem to understand this. As I said, you know, the Catholic education system has a significant problem with people engaging in this sort of activity. On the other hand, with only subtly different variables, somebody might accidentally come across somebody who's engaged in, say, child abuse, and then there is a legal obligation and a moral obligation to be reporting that. Now, the actual variation in the parameters can be quite subtle, but in each case we do have a truth there. In the first case, a truth that, you know, somebody was engaged in an illicit or what the church would classify as an immoral activity. Others, of course, might have a different opinion that it is not immoral at all. The right wing would say it's always immoral, but you know, there would be variations within a community as to, you know, that conduct. You know, perhaps the couple were close to getting married or something, and you know, they really don't know what went on. In the second case, you know, there's objectively, yes, there has been child abuse, there has been a breach of moral law and legal law, and something has to be reported. I find a lot of confusion, particularly in the right wing and the conservative elements of the church, when you get into this territory of truth and absolute truth, and propounding that we know the bloody truth and everybody else are heretics and that sort of thing. Truth is a very subtle, nuanced sort of territory that we need to negotiate with enormous caution. Thank you. This is another little experiment trying to use video on Catholica.